We'll just keep talking. Okay. Great. So welcome everybody, and thank you for making time on this kind of stressful and momentous Wednesday afternoon. We actually, when we scheduled this, we had forgotten that it was the first Wednesday in November, which usually comes after the first Tuesday in November. But it's great to have with us today Peter Schwartz, dear old friend and colleague. Peter's in Hawaii right now. Is it right? You're in Kauai, right, Peter?
No, the Big Island.
I was on the Big Island, even better. Enjoying the Hawaiian sunshine. But Peter, for those of you who don't know him, there we go. That looks nice. Peter's a longtime Berkeley resident and has tons and tons of connections with UC Berkeley and with the iSchool and others. Right now, Peter is the Senior Vice President for Strategic Planning at Salesforce. And Peter, I think we're going to talk for maybe about 20-25 minutes about the history of what you've learned and experienced over the years as you've kind of tracked and in some strange but beautiful and interesting ways led aspects of the kind of digital revolution that we're all living through now. And then we'll open up for questions and we'll have an informal conversation. That work for you?
Sure. And let me say thanks. And for those of you who don't know, Steve really is a dear old friend. That was not made up. We've been friends for decades, friends, collaborators, neighbors, etc. So it's really a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you for making the time. So let's go back to the early days. You grew up in Rochester, right?
No, I went near Philadelphia. Went to school in Troy, New York, at RPI.
Okay. So you were at RPI.
Yeah.
And so at some point in the 70s, you kind of find your way out to the Bay Area, and you end up at what used to be called the Stanford Research Institute, was I believe now called SRI, or maybe it was SRI back then. And it was kind of a crazy, interesting environment. Doug Engelbart was there. Maybe not everybody knows who Doug Engelbart was, but maybe you'll say a little bit about him and the like, and who were constructing, maybe without even knowing it, the really early building blocks of the move from what was mainstream computing on something called the mainframe to this new thing called the PC, and of course, ultimately the roots of the internet. And so I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about like, what was that like? And what made that community so able to kind of see the future and invent it?
It was a very exciting time. I arrived at Palo Alto in 1972, started at SRI the next year, and it was still called Stanford Research Institute in those days. It had to give up the name because Stanford insisted on it because SRI was doing military research. Okay. There were about 3,000 scientists at SRI, so I mean, it was quite big, and it was the place where Stanford faculty could do interesting big research projects. So a lot of the scientists there were faculty at Stanford. So there's a lot of flow back and forth, and it was also the moment when obviously a very critical couple of technologies were coming along. The microchip had just begun to hit, and that was a generative technology because you could do tons and tons of stuff with it. You could make games, or you could make personal computers, or you could make control systems for guidance systems for missiles. You could do lots of stuff with it. It was a very, you could make medical instruments. You could make MRI machines, all of which needed microchips. So it was a piece of technology that exploded in a sense. Many different things that could be done. The other thing that came along at that moment was, of course, the ARPANET. Mm-hmm. And DARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, actually said, well, you know, we have these computers at different academic institutions. Wouldn't it be good if we could bring them together, share information, et cetera? And so, in fact, UCLA started the project. SRI was the kind of second major node. And so UCLA was node number one of the ARPANET. SRI was node number two, and it grew to about 70 universities, right? And it was meant really for collaboration. Now, the truth is what we actually did was play games. Right. That was like the very first thing we did. We invented games that could be played where Stanford could play MIT. Right. That was the natural thing to have happen immediately. Right. The two games were Star Trader and Star Wars before there was the movie. In fact, Stuart Brand wrote a famous essay in Rolling Stone that became a part of a book about the gamers. Right. And in that essay, he mentioned something called the personal computer, which he thought was coming along. And it was the first mention anywhere of the idea of a personal computer. That was 1974.
Yeah.
And so it was a very exciting environment. People at Stanford, there was Xerox PARC, which was the Palo Alto Research Center, where the interface that we are now using was invented, right? Where they were really the first to begin to play with video conferencing of the sort we're now doing, and so on. There was what was called the Computer Music Group that was inventing new ways of creating new media, and so on. That's where Alan Kay was hanging out and inventing what really became the interface, what was the Dynabook, which really became the iPad, and so on. So, you know, these were the ideas that were all floating around in that environment, lots of innovation. But there was one other piece of the history that most people don't know and don't remember, which was that there was massive unemployment in Santa Clara County. The Vietnam War was winding down, and Lockheed was laying people off, GTE, Sylvania, Ford, etc. There were 70,000 unemployed engineers.
Yeah.
And they were desperate. There were no jobs. And then the microchip lands in that fertile ground, along with two guys leave Fairchild and start something called a venture capital firm, Kleiner Perkins. That was where it started. Kleiner and Perkins started the first VC fund. They had these engineers who were desperate. You have the microchip coming along, the internet to connect everybody together, and boom, Silicon Valley is born. In 1972, it was desperation. In 1976, it was Silicon Valley. And that was the moment when all of these technologies and financing mechanisms and desperate talent, all these engineers who were unemployed, and they started companies not because they were entrepreneurial, because they were hungry, literally hungry, right? And there was the capital and the technology that made it happen.
Fantastic. You know, the theme keeps coming through the history is when you have gamers and unemployed engineers and some underpriced assets, and you put those things together, some pretty cool stuff happens. And it seems to happen again and again that way.
Yeah, I was like roughly one of the first 1,000 people on the ARPANET, played games myself. And in fact, that was the basis of what became the film War Games.
Ah, fantastic. All right, I'm sure we'll come back to that. All right, so let's jump from SRI to Royal Dutch Shell. So at some point you leave SRI. I guess the weather in Palo Alto wasn't good enough for you, so you wanted to move to London.
Yeah, I like damp.
Right. And, it was sort of like a pretty big leap, right? From a place like SRI to one of the world's largest energy firms, or maybe at that point, really an oil company. But Shell was pioneering at that time a new foresight methodology. And obviously there was something about that drew you in. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your early experiences at Shell.
Sure.
With scenario thinking, what made it, what attracted you to that kind of work, and how you saw and sort of evolved the methods and practices that you did during your time at Shell.
Sure. Well, it really came down to the fact that I'd had this vision of wanting to try and help organizations make better long-term decisions, that in the face of massive uncertainty. And that's what we were doing at SRI. I was part of a group there. But I got to know the first head of scenario planning at Shell, a guy named Pierre Vac, a remarkable Frenchman. And Pierre really set it up at Shell. And he had the big insight that I didn't understand, and really is why I went to work with him, was that the goal of scenario planning was not predicting the future, i.e. getting it right. It was leading to a better decision today. So the measure of success was a better choice, not a better prediction.
Yeah.
And so to do that, you really had to understand the mind of the decision maker. And so you needed to spend as much time understanding what we called the microcosm as well as the macrocosm, the world out there. So when Pierre had to retire, he asked me to take his place as his successor. And so I took that opportunity to learn from him. He had become my mentor. And of course, Shell was the leading organization doing this worldwide. And so the opportunity to be the navigator of the second biggest company in the world and have the opportunity to learn from that was really quite remarkable. So I couldn't say no. And the truth is, it was a remarkable opportunity working with Pierre and with the leadership of Shell in helping to make the kind of long-term choices. And we got a number of things right. We made a lot of big choices, and I learned a lot from that.
Yeah. I don't know if you'll remember this actually, but just going back to this point about sort of long-term thinking and contingency planning under uncertainty, the way you and I met was with Phil Tetlock, actually, when Tetlock and I were looking at the early releases of transcripts from the Carter administration's hostage rescue effort in 1979. And what really stood out was nobody had made a contingency plan.
Right.
So the generals had told Carter, there's a 60% chance of success, which, kind of roughly means a 40% chance of failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody ever said, okay, how will we know if this is going wrong, and what will we do, and what will it take for us to pull the trigger? And I remember as Telek and I were talking about this, we're like, there must be people in the business world who kind of think about this in a systematic way. And somehow we found ourselves to you.
Well, that's what, that is literally what we were trying to do, is to avoid, for example, catastrophic big errors and make sure we get the kind of robust decisions that, look, the oil industry, remember, had just gone through 2 huge discontinuities. And it was also important to remember, part of the reason the credibility of that team at Shell was back in 1971, Pierre and his team had said there's about to be a major oil crisis and price explosion. And Shell didn't pay attention. They said, what do you know, right? And then it happened. And they had made some really bad choices as a result that cost them a lot, right? And so that had a lot to help the credibility. And they did it again in the late 70s. So frankly, a good track record of first getting it right and being ignored, and then second, getting it right and having them actually pay attention and having it turn out well. This was a good foundation for further success.
Fantastic. So the lesson is get it right and be ignored the first time, and then move from there.
Well, you'd prefer to be actually paid attention to.
I guess so. All right. So let's talk about then the what you did when you come back to Berkeley, and you start this little boutique firm called Global Business Network, which is where we met. And I just remember, it's a very, very vivid memory walking into those cool offices in Emeryville. Maybe it was 1993, to meet. It was a very small team of people, and to meet the team. And I had this incredible experience of seeing, okay, in your case, an aeronautical engineer, Peter, and then there's this philosophy professor named Jay, and then there's a classics scholar turned entrepreneur named Lawrence, and then there's an old oil energy industry guy named Napier, and then there's this crazy guy from the Merry Pranksters and the Whole Earth catalog named Stuart Brand, who was sort of thought of as the world, kind of the grandfather of the modern environmental movement. And I only bring this up because when you walk into that as a kind of a disciplinary academic from the outside, you say to yourself, there's no way these people can talk to each other. This has got to be a disaster. But somehow it was like magic. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. And I want to talk about that because in many ways, what we try to do at a place like the Berkeley High School is to create replicate something like that, an environment like that, where you have people from really different fields, and the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And like I said, it kind of felt like magic at GBN in the early days. So what makes that work?
There is actually a simple secret to it. It's not complicated.
Great.
It began with recognizing that networks matter. And that really also went back to Pierre. He said, look, I want to have a network of what he called remarkable people who would challenge our thinking, who would be out on the leading edge of change, and who could actually kind of have that sense of there's something big happening out there, even if they don't know what it is. So that notion of a network, and the idea was to connect that network and have them kind of spark off of each other in ways that were generative. And they had managed to create fora for that to work. So the concept of network was central to this. But then we realized quite early on, and I think it had to do with the values and character of the founding partners in Global Business Network, was that there was one overarching value, and this is the secret, and that's generosity. Mm-hmm. That networks exist because of generosity, what you put in. If you are in a network and only expecting to take out, the network doesn't exist. It only exists because what people actually come to give to it. As you know, I've helped work on movies, and I finally figured out what a producer does. A producer blows enough hot air till people believe that a balloon is appearing. And then by and large, the balloon actually appears. The director shows up, the actors show up, the money shows up, and so on. And networks are a bit like that. You can wire them, but they don't live unless people are willing to put something into it. It appears because of what people give. And so the central value of GBN was generosity. We gave people books. We didn't charge them for it. We gave them away, right? Said, our stock and trade is ideas. We're not going to own those ideas. We're going to give them those ideas. You probably have a shelf full of GBN book club books, right? With a little silver label on it. That's how we kept our brand going. But the act was an act of generosity. And so for me, information networks are inherently dependent upon mutual generosity of the participants. And I think, frankly, that's a struggle in academia where you want to appropriate the value of the ideas for your own and get credit for it, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard, therefore, to do exactly what you just said, make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. If I keep my part, you keep your part, then it doesn't really become something greater. And so for us, that value of generosity was central. And frankly, many people couldn't understand, what's that about? The corporation doesn't practice generosity. That's not a business value. But in fact, we discovered it was.
Yeah, it's interesting. It really, now that you put that kind of a phrase on it, it really was remarkable in that way, that people sort of like came to it knowing they were going to give more than they got. And they ended up getting more than they gave, but they didn't know they were getting more than they gave. It felt like they were giving. And it was a remarkable, extraordinarily diverse group of people too. I mean, I remember, it was everything from like, I don't know, Brian Eno to John Zeisman, one of my colleagues here at Berkeley, to
the manager of the Grateful Dead, to Mary Catherine Bateson.
Martin Wolf from the finance. I mean, it was a crazy, interesting group of people.
Danny Hillis.
To be there with them to talk.
Yeah, exactly.
Something magnetic about it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about like what that was like in the 1990s. It felt like, looking back on it, we talked about scenario planning a lot, but I think what we were really doing, at least from my perspective, was helping private firms, some government agencies, some nonprofits, to understand this thing, this kind of mysterious thing called the World Wide Web, and what it was going to mean for their practices, for their businesses, how it could change the world. And actually, increasingly, I felt like as the 90s went on, even more so, how they could use it to change the world in a kind of a normative sense. And I think, we had a lot of good ideas. There were a lot of robust arguments, and we certainly had a lot of fun along the way, including making some plays and things, and as you remember, and casting our Scottish colleague as Adam Smith. So like, look, I was touching it. You were right in the middle of it. What do you remember from that period as most important and maybe most surprising?
Well, remember our involvement with these kinds of networks that became the World Wide Web began really with what you already mentioned, the well. Mm-hmm. And so we had a strong sense of what kind of a network communication could be like. And so there was already a strong foundation in saying, all right, now this new electronic forum and set of connections could be something much bigger than people think, that it could be totally transformative. And in fact, I suspect you were involved in the project we did for ABC, Universal Studios, let's see who else was in that. One of the big food companies, and one of the big ad agencies, right? And we said, there's this new thing, it's about 94 or so, there's this new thing coming along called the internet, and it's going to transform all your businesses. How you sell, how you provide information to customers, how you do finance, all that stuff is going to be changed. And the deeper we got into it, the bigger we saw the potential. Again, I put a lot of that at Stewart's door, not surprisingly. It was something that I think he was deeply involved in and had a very intuitive sense of what the magnitude of the impact was. So for us, what we saw at that moment was this was a transformative moment, not simply an evolutionary moment. Something really big was happening that was going to change the world in very fundamental ways. And in ways that we thought, and it was right and wrong, and history bears us out, was in values that were aligned with ours, the ability to share information and knowledge. It was pre-Wikipedia, but we imagined something like Wikipedia would be there. I'm an encyclopedia junkie. I actually have a Britannica 3 right in my basement in Berkeley. Having said that, we could see kind of what was coming with what became Wikipedia, that world of universal access. And we thought that would be a fundamental good, that in a world where knowledge was valued, that if everybody had access to that value, this could only be a good thing. We frankly didn't see some of the darker sides that have now come to pass. But that was really what drove us in that kind of engagement.
Yeah, really interesting. I want to double down on that. I mean, there was a pervasive optimism in that space that was like, we always just sort of, and yeah, in some ways now it looks a little bit naive, but at the time it was actually really generative to focus on the upside, the upside, the upside. What does that look like? How can we get there? How do we maximize it? And what do we have to do to change to actually make it possible? So
Right.
those were exciting times.
Yeah. Well, we also helped start something called Wired Magazine at the time.
Right.
Lawrence was on the board. We were investors. It was almost a house magazine for GBN. I had 5 cover stories. The big one was the long boom in '97, which I argued there was going to be this long boom. And I said, now there are a couple of things that could break it. One would be a financial crisis, one would be tension with China, and another would be a major terrorist attack against the United States. Oops. Yeah. All 3 happened, and the long boom broke. But that was the mood of the moment. We clearly, in the late '90s, were seeing enormous upside potential.
Yeah, it was amazing. All right, so let's talk a little bit, maybe 2 more questions about sort of the from a substantive perspective. I mean, look, I mean, for people who like myself who sort of like live in a world where we have to specialize, we're always struggling with, people sometimes talk about the the T, like how much specialization, how much of my day do I spend being specialized, and how much of my day do I have to range widely in order to not get boxed in intellectually. You've sort of navigated that in a particularly interesting way. I mean, I'm thinking about like you and I worked together on steel tariffs. We worked together on dollar-yen exchange rates. We worked together on business models for greater access to advanced pharmaceuticals. And of course, we worked together on the Hart-Rudman Commission, trying to foresee the future of the U.S. national security environment 25 years forward in 1999, which was a crazy, ridiculously ambitious piece of work. I have to ask you, like, it seems like you've never really allowed yourself to get boxed in and siloed. But at this, like, how do you do that?
Well, again, I think there's a very simple idea, and it's manifest in how I hire people. When I'm hiring people, the thing I look for most is ruthless curiosity, desperate hunger to know stuff. Right? There are people who read, who listen to lectures, who just, they'll read different kinds of magazines across a great wide spectrum of journals and magazines. They'll read books across wide spectrum, from philosophy to science to history and so on. They have a catholicity of taste in ideas. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not specialists. Stuart was a biologist. I'm an astronautical engineer. Jay was a philosopher. But and you mentioned Lawrence was a classic scholar. Napier Collins was a graduate of history of science from Cambridge. So we all had kind of specialties, but one of the things that tied us all together was a wide-ranging interest across lots of things, from theater to poetry to philosophy to science, and that hunger for really to know more is really what I think is the secret there. And so the term I've always liked is ruthless curiosity.
Yeah. I'll just reminded me of a trick that you taught me. It wouldn't work the same today probably, but I think it was you who said, go to one of those magazine stores, look at the magazine rack, right, and pick out some magazines in areas you know absolutely nothing about and can't possibly have an interest in, and read them.
Exactly. I mean, for example, one that had a big impact on was Thrasher magazine, which you don't read Thrasher?
I have Thrasher is the magazine of skateboarders. I don't have a subscription to Thrasher.
The Thrasher is the magazine of skateboarders.
Okay.
And which I didn't know until I picked up a copy of Thrasher many years ago and said, oh, now this is an interesting subculture. There's something interesting happening here. Anyway, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was the closest you could get to the World Wide Web before there was the World Wide Web, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so let's end with maybe some foresight ideas that you're now experimenting with. I mean, you're sort of in this unique position, sitting at the top of Salesforce Tower, and doing strategic planning for a company like Salesforce. I mean, that's got to be one of the world's most crazy, interesting jobs right now. Also one of the world's most demanding. So to the extent that you can, tell us what you're thinking about as maybe the 2 or 3 critical uncertainties, as we used to talk about them in scenario planning for Salesforce and for the sectors of which it's a part going forward. I mean, here we are, November of 2020. And let's imagine that actually, as the way, we were taught to do, you taught us to do, is let's imagine it's 2030 and we're sitting at the top of Salesforce Tower and we're looking back and saying, wow, what a decade that was. What will we be talking about?
Well, look, it's a great question, and I have to be careful about what I say, obviously, in that respect. So do not take anything I'm about to say as an offer to sell stock or buy stock, right? Call it, or any insider knowledge. I'm not about to reveal anything insider. Let me be very clear about that. Look, we face several big challenges that will have to have been resolved by that. Salesforce is 20 years old. We're amazingly successful, right? When I joined the company 9 years ago, we were 3,000 people. We're 57,000 now. We were 3 billion in revenue. We're 22 billion in revenue. We were 20 billion in market cap. We're 230 billion in market cap. So it's had staggering growth, right? It grows at an unbelievable rate, 25, 30% a year. How do you sustain that? And business models in this industry change quite regularly, and very few companies have been able to make that transition to the next generation of growth. They did great, and then the business model evolved. I mean, a good example was Oracle, which was really the kind of software company of the last generation. Amazing success, made Larry Ellison one of the richest people in the world. Terrific company at doing what it did well. Then along comes the cloud. Ex-Oracle guy, Mark Benioff, says, well, I'm going to deliver services over the internet. You don't have to own any infrastructure. Oops, Oracle's growth slows. It struggled to make the transition to the cloud. We are going to face the same thing. So question, what's that next transition look like? And can we be among the very few companies that actually made that transition? Microsoft has done it well. IBM has not, just to take 2 examples. From our competitor companies. So number one is, can we make a transition to a bigger, a new kind of business model? The second thing is that the big companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all have great cloud computing infrastructure and are building on top of that, radically advancing their competitive advantage over us. And third, what we're seeing is an enormous increase in the collaborative environment all across this industry, of people having to reinvent it at very high speed. What's happened as a result of the pandemic is the speed of industrial change has increased unbelievably fast. So if we're looking back from 2030, what will Salesforce look like? Well, first of all, we will have acquired Google Cloud Services.
Okay.
Because Google isn't doing too well with it, and their enterprise software barely exists. So essentially, we will now have our own cloud platform that we are now building on.
Include and the hardware. You want to own the hardware.
Oh no, we don't need the hardware. The hardware is fine, but what we're doing is radically lowering our costs, and now being able to build a platform for additional enterprise software that builds outward from Salesforce into ways that I really probably shouldn't say too much about, but Salesforce at that point will be about a $250 billion market cap. $250 billion sales, and probably something close to $1 trillion market cap at that point.
And will it still be denominated in US dollars?
That's a good question. Yes, it will.
Okay, good. Okay. So that's a really interesting vision. Let's just like rock it out one more time. And this is the last question I'll ask, and then we'll turn to questions from everybody else who's on the chat. When you step outside Salesforce, I mean, let's say we've been through some pretty interesting discontinuities over the last couple of years. The pandemic is the one that's on everyone's mind right now. But we used to talk about politics a lot. There's been a few discontinuities in that space. There's been some geopolitical shifts that probably, came faster than many of us expected, although maybe directionally were pretty much what we were expecting was going to happen. In that macro environment of, the steepum categories, social, technology, economic, environmental, political, what do you see as maybe the biggest critical uncertainty that you wish you had greater insight into, just for the sake of understanding how the world works?
Well, look, the thing that I think is giving enormous shape to the geopolitics and economics of the next decade is very obvious, and that has to do with the U.S. and China. You know, it's not, it's banal to say so, but I think it's true. We had to adapt our strategy because of it. You know, we had to follow our customers into China, but we know doing business for a Western computer company in China is not particularly salutary. So instead, we licensed our software to Alibaba, right? And our customers now get Salesforce from Alibaba in China, right? This is all public. There's nothing secret about that. But now, as you will have noticed in the last few days, Ali may have hit some issues, right? One of our assumptions was that Alibaba gets along very well with the Chinese government, so therefore we don't have to worry about that. Well, maybe not. And so it's an interesting new twist in our strategy. This was a strategy that was sort of, I was behind and it helped to drive. Jack Ma is someone I know. And so the question really is, will this relationship go so sour that it really has a profound effect on our business?
Yeah, really interesting. All right, let me flip to some questions that folks answered, if you're okay. Sort of like,
Sure.
let's see. So you know, interesting question. Somebody said it's an amazing insight about the value of being curious. So you called it relentless curiosity. Some people feel that it's well, let me put the question this way. Is there still space for what we used to call generalists in today's world?
Well, it's a yes and, it's not an either
Yeah.
or. So the answer is, I believe you need some degree of specialization and generalization. In my case, it was science and engineering. That has given me the ability to do things that I wouldn't have done otherwise. Jay, as a philosopher, gets into issues of human understanding and insight at a level of depth that I can't manage, but his interest is broad. So I think it's not an either or question, it's a both and. I like people who go both deep and wide.
Yeah, yeah. And how hard is it for you to find those people who can work on a team?
It's a challenge, but the honest truth over the years is I think it's developmental. The people who choose to participate want to develop themselves in that way. And so that's what, you know, we taught training courses in scenario planning, right?
Yeah.
You know, and we didn't teach it by lecture, we taught it by having people actually do it.
Do it, right.
And that actually tended to bring out, and they would see in the behavior of other people, precisely those qualities being manifest that allow them to be in a kind of intellectually sharing and collaborative environment.
You know, it's one of the things that I learned when I moved to the I-School from a traditional political science discipline was like teaching means projects. And like most of our courses are designed around project work because, you know, you start with trying to do something, you learn a little bit of the theory behind it, you try to do it again, you learn a little bit more of the theory behind it, you try to do it again. And that's what but you know, it's not always traditional way universities teach. But we've tried to do it differently. And I think it's more fun that way actually too, and for us. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So here's another interesting question. Going back to Salesforce for a moment. You guys have worked really hard to build a more diverse workforce in a field that doesn't always make that easy. It's something that at Berkeley we paid a lot of attention to over the years. Obviously, like many people, we're you know, our energy around that has really increased. I just wonder if you know, you've seen some transitions in that. I can't imagine, for example, that the scenario unit at Shell when you were there was particularly diverse.
Well, it was diverse in a global sense. We had people from around the world.
That's
you know,
true.
I had 50 people on my staff, and I probably had 13 countries represented.
Okay.
I only had one woman. It was an oil company. It's a boys' club.
Yeah, right. The oil, but has the oil industry changed in that regard?
No.
Okay.
It's still a white man's boy club.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see? Because one of the things we sometimes think about is trying to find really compelling, and forgive me for putting it this way, but almost quantitative metrics that can help document to skeptics the value of a diverse team.
Look,
Yes,
for me,
yeah.
it's very simple. It's actually not very complicated. And look, you've been part of what I'm about to say. Um, the I've gotten the future wrong a few times, painfully so.
Never.
And the 100% of the errors was a lack of diversity. I think you were involved in the Mexico project that we did on the future of Mexico when we had a meeting outside of Mexico City for about 75 customers. We had a panel of Mexican economists and bankers, and this was right after Salinas had stepped down. Zedillo was going to take over. It was all going to be really great. And this was going to be an upside vision of the future of Mexico. And we had three scenarios: good, better, and best. And 2 weeks later, Mexico collapsed, right? I mean, the US was in a $30 billion rescue effort. We looked absolutely stupid. I mean, you've just told your customers there's only three scenarios from good to great, right? And meanwhile, they completely collapses 2 weeks later. We were all just talking to ourselves. There was no diversity in the room. The panel consisted of people who all knew each other, were talking to each other, were just simply reinforcing the same body of knowledge. So what I have learned is in a world of diversity, pardon me, in a world of uncertainty, diversity matters profoundly. It is how you challenge your thinking. And every time I've gotten the future wrong, every time I've made a bad decision, it was because of a lack of diversity, 100% of the time.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting. Probably different dimensions too that you could define over time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's another really interesting. This is a challenging one. So so you once wrote a book called The Art of the Long View.
Right.
God, what year was that?
1991.
Okay, so it was the early days of GBN. It was probably reflecting on the Shell experience in particular.
Okay.
And so somebody asked, thinking back, are there any changes or like if you were to write that book today, would you write it really differently? Are there things that you would change really substantially?
Sure. A couple of things. I mean, first of all, the lesson about diversity is not really in the book. It's mentioned, but I hadn't had the experiences yet that really brought that message home. So that I would certainly identify that. You know, in those days, there was no internet access to information. There's a whole chapter called on being an information hunter. Well, these days, being an information hunter is a whole lot easier and different, but hard to differentiate. How do you get to the unique and interesting stuff? So, you know, what is the way in which you gather information would be radically different.
Yeah.
Today, I'd want to do much more with computer simulations. In those days, it was hard, complex. You needed big machines and big teams and all kinds of stuff. You know, today there's lots of ways to do that that connect people. And then finally, you know, our network involved physical networking, right? We bring people together in a room somewhere. Well, being able to use the networking that we're now doing would certainly be part of the story.
Yeah, super interesting. You know, one of the things that I really remember, I feel like I learned from that book was the importance of narrative and storytelling. In kind of like you building a model. And this is something that actually we train our data scientists. Like you can build the very best technical model and get the most kind of compelling data science results, but you have to be able to kind of render that in a narrative, in a storytelling way that gets into the minds and the guts of people who may not be, for example, native data scientists. And it's something that a lot of our students kind of react to originally, like, what are you talking about? Like, why would I tell my story in a fairy tale structure? But over time, it kind of works, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There's no question. Look, stories give meaning to fact. We're natural storytellers, human beings. We tell stories in our head all the time, right? It's how we go through the day. And stories, but particularly where you're dealing with things that are inherently speculative, what is to come. Even if it's founded on good factual analysis, forecasts, models, etc. Nevertheless, somebody will create the story, either the listener or the speaker, right? And so, you know, you can just present the facts and hope they create the right story. Or you can give them a story. Now, they may challenge your story. Oh, wait a minute, I have a different story. Actually, that's even better. Because then you have a real conflict of stories and different interpretations for that same set of facts. That's very powerful. And so from my point of view, the essence of scenario planning is great storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's something that we've tried to, you know, I've tried to incorporate some of that discipline into my teaching too. And I feel like it does help actually.
Yeah. Well, you're a very good storyteller.
Well, thank you. But I learned it from the best. Let's go back to now to a question about sort of local stuff. So you're not in Berkeley today,
Right.
but you've been in Berkeley a long, long, long time. And I think a lot of folks who live in the Bay Area, I mean, I've lived here, I moved to Palo Alto in '83, so I've lived here a long time too, feel like San Francisco has undergone some not so great evolution over the last, particularly over the last decade. And it sort of lost some of what made it really special as a city, maybe in the '90s and the 2000s. And like, maybe this isn't work you do consciously, but surely, you know, commuting between Berkeley and Salesforce Tower and all this sort of stuff, you kind of ask yourself, what does the future of this city look like? And so somebody wanted to kind of get your reflections on like, what do you see San Francisco in 2030?
Well, you could actually read about it because I published about it not long ago.
Well,
At Salesforce, we do volunteer projects.
okay.
My volunteer project in 2018 and 2019 was scenario planning for the Bay Area with SPUR, the regional planning organization. So I led a group of 90 regional bodies, governments of Berkeley and cities and agencies, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, all these guys, BART, they came together in a series of workshops to develop scenarios for the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. So if you go to the SPUR website, you can see them. Okay, that's SPUR. It's probably spur.org, I would guess. But it unequivocally, what came out was a picture that I think we all understand and what the real challenge is, and therefore what the right answer is. And that, you know, we've gotten so rich and has been so successful that we've made life very hard for everybody who's not. Mm-hmm. And in so many different ways. And that the inequality has become profound. The housing challenge is the most clear expression of it. The sprawl all the way out to Tracy and Stockton for commuting is another dimension of it, and so on. So unless we can fundamentally change that direction, the Bay Area will become much less habitable, much less desirable, and so on. So I think that challenge is very clear. But and I think the answer to it is also not all that challenging. Look, it starts with solving the housing problem. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And right now, what we've made it is very hard to build housing. Right, the NIMBYs, the local NIMBYs, have made it very difficult. So essentially, breaking the hold, and there's a few simple, both legislative and regulatory decisions like CEQA reform. CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act that allows anybody to stop a project and say, "Wait a minute, you haven't got an adequate environmental statement. Sorry, go back and do your environmental assessment again." And delay the project, delay the project, and delay the project. And there are other regulations like that. So that even environmentalists want to see CEQA reform because they've seen it abused. Yeah. So I think the big challenge that we face in the Bay Area that would trigger everything else is a radical reform of housing policy.
Interesting. Peter, maybe as a last question, before I let you get back to your day, let's go back to the energy sector for a moment. Talk about energy. So, you know, the energy sector has changed an awful lot in the last decade. We had fracking, and now solar energy is so inexpensive that it's almost insane not to have panels on your house.
I have 40 of them on here and Tesla power walls.
Right. I got a power wall too, only because our power gets turned off when the wind, you know, goes over 2 miles an hour. But it's actually remarkable technology to be able to store up enough power in a battery sitting in your house to run your house for several days. Right. Like, that's something that we could not have like taken for granted 4 or 5 years ago. So let's rock it forward a little bit. I mean, what, and on the other hand, we've got fracking, right? And we're now the United States, the world's largest energy producer. What does that look like?
Look, where we're going is very obvious. Dan Yergin has a very good new book on the subject, which I highly recommend. His name escapes me at the moment. It'll come back to me. But in which he makes the point that I think the energy future is very clear with one minor important exception. That is that we're going to clearly use a whole lot less of the dirty fossil fuels. And by that, I mean, first of all, coal. And it's not because we've made coal so awkward and expensive. It's that East Coast coal has gotten expensive. West Coast coal is cheap, and Montana, Wyoming coal. And so we've seen a decline in coal, but And that will continue because it is dirty and relatively expensive, even compared to natural gas. And fracking has led to a dramatic increase in natural gas. Meanwhile, we've seen electric vehicles come along in reasonably swift way to begin to affect gasoline consumption. So what you can see is the energy mix of, say, 2040 or 2050 will be almost no coal.
Mhm.
Oil will have peaked demand, not production. There'll still be plenty of oil to produce, but we will have basically somewhere along the line hit peak oil demand. And that demand will be used for two and maybe only for transport fuels, aviation, some cars, some trucks, and shipping. Things that are going to be difficult. There'll still be old cars on the road that will use gasoline. We don't have yet a good alternative fuel for aircraft. We don't have good alternative fuels for ships. So we'll still be burning some oil for transport, but it will have been capped somewhere along the line and will be on a long decline because almost all surface transport will be moved toward electric. And then we'll have plenty of natural gas for both electric production and balancing solar. So not everybody's going to be able to store their solar and wind. So at night, the gas power plant runs while during the day, the solar power plant runs and so on. Or it's a cloudy day, the gas kicks in when the solar isn't available and so on. So we'll have a mixed system for probably several decades beyond. So it is renewables and fossils, but fossils becoming increasingly the cleanest of those fossils, natural gas.
So are we going to be able to reduce carbon emissions quickly enough to save us from 3 degrees centigrade?
No, we're not.
Okay, then maybe we should call that a day.
No, we're too late. We're too late. The momentum of the system is too great. The growth in the system is too great. So we do need to lower the trajectory. But right now we're still on an upward trajectory. We need to go negative if we're going to do that. We need to figure out how to take it out of the atmosphere, not how can we slow the growth rate. That's the issue.
Right.
And so we're not even close to that yet.
So maybe that the next thing we need to figure out is how to minimize the disruption of adjustment that the world is going to have to make.
Yes.
To that over the course of, and it's going to be bad for us here in the Bay Area because we have fire, but imagine what it's like if you live in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and it's 130 degrees outside, right?
Or if you live on a Pacific island at sea level.
As you almost do.
I'm at 600 feet.
Good enough.
Okay.
Listen, Peter, thank you so much for making the time. It's always
My pleasure.
a tremendous amount of fun to talk. And listen, stay well, stay healthy, enjoy Hawaii.
Same to you and same to all of your colleagues at Cal. It's really a pleasure. I will be back in Berkeley before too long.
We look forward to seeing you back here in Berkeley.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.